The Scars of Eden, Chapter 4. The Persistence of Memory. Ngambri Country Today. Why did you have to bring aliens into it? If you can imagine the tone of a china shop owner asking me why I let the bull inside, that's the tone. I mean, I am with you in 90% of what you're saying. I just don't see why you needed to bring aliens into it. The it that my friend Adam doesn't want aliens brought into is his theology. Adam and I trained together back in the 80s and have made much of our journey in ministry in parallel. We have both given decades to the world of church life, each helping in different ways to keep the ecclesiastical show on the road. While I was planting new church communities, Adam was working to refresh established congregations. When I was training pastors in the interpretation of text, the Bible in particular, Adam was wrestling with church politics. Adam was exploring the frontiers of deconstructed organic church while I was serving the Anglican Church as an archdeacon, troubleshooting communities in transition or in deep difficulty. We have both earned our stripes in the world of ministry and have developed a strong mutual respect. So when Adam says, "Paul, let's stay friends, but I won't be reading your book," I can't help but feel a bit disappointed. Adam, in turn, is disappointed that I have brought aliens into it. But from my perspective, it really isn't my fault. The aliens were there long before I ever noticed. When an ultimate Frisbee injury offered me the opportunity of a study retreat in the shipping crate cabin at the end of our driveway, I knew I wanted to use the time to drill down into some of the anomalies in the book of Genesis. I also knew that there might be an alien or two lurking somewhere in the hidden layers of its language. Yet I was somewhat unprepared for the full extent of what was to emerge as I began unwrapping the translation questions of Genesis. "Look, I can see all the same problems you see," Adam explains. "Morally, there is no way you can take the Genesis stories at face value. That's just obvious. Any honest reader can see that what Genesis claims about God is totally at odds with any kind of morality. I don't have a problem seeing all that. But the way I see it is that these are the writings of ancient peoples trying to tease out where God was in the puzzle. There's no need to bring aliens in just to make sense of it." For me, the red pill moment came when I realized that the word Elohim, a word often translated as God in the biblical text, was in all probability far better translated as the powerful ones. This is not a small change. In fact, as I quickly learned, making the translation switch alters the whole place of the Bible in the panoply of world mythologies. With a cup of tea in one hand and a Bible in the other, this was the case I now make to Adam one afternoon at our local tea house. You see, in the conventional translations, the translators make a call as to when to translate Elohim as God and when to translate it as God or gods, false god or false gods, demon or demons, angel or angels, or local chieftain or chieftains. You might want to know how they make that call. With the choices as they are, the Bible looks like it contradicts almost every other ancestral narrative of beginnings. It's as if the Bible is saying, forget what all these other cultures have to say. This is what really happened. But the moment you translate Elohim as the powerful ones, the Bible stories do an instant about turn and reveal themselves for what they really are, which is a summary of the stories from out of ancient Samaria, Babylonia, Assyria, and Acadia. And those original versions are not stories about God. They're stories about the sky people, another species who arrived from somewhere else, modified our ancestors, ruled over them, and colonized the planet. When the Bible was monotheized, in that same moment, the history of our ancestors' intersection with sky people was buried. Yet it's all still there, just a translation away from being blindly obvious. Adam silently eyes his fresh cup of tea and stirs it for what feels like several minutes. It's really a brain twister of an exercise to absorb the implications of these choices in translation. So many beliefs and assumptions are built on top of one another that there's no real way of fast-tracking all the necessary deconstruction and reconstruction of worldview and theology. Suffice it to say that by the end of our conversation, Adam is no closer than when he was before to wanting to read his old friend's new book and welcome aliens into his familiar world. Clearly, a few more cups of tea will be needed. I can't be critical of my friend, though. It is a total reframing, but it happens because of what's already in the text. The translation key I mentioned to Adam not only reveals the family connection of the Bible and the Sumerian text, but it affirms themes in a great many of the stories of beginnings curated by indigenous cultures all around the world. That's why today I am looking out over the Australian bush of my hometown with revered Aboriginal elder Shane Mortimer. Shane is an incredible person, a man who simultaneously embodies charisma and calm, peace and passion. He is a powerful advocate for his people and for the land of Australia. Early in the 20th century, the site for the new Australian Capital Territory was identified by the colonial government, and the authorities began rounding up the local indigenous people to remove them from the land and make way for a new, white capital city. Shane's family was one of the first to be removed from their ancestral lands. The only reason that Shane's aunties and uncles did not become part of this stolen generation was that his grandfather was wealthy enough to be able to bribe the Catholic nuns with sums of money large enough to persuade them not to forcibly take his children to be raised in one of the country's child detention centers, euphemistically referred to as missions. The purpose of Australia's stolen generation policy was to extinguish Aboriginal culture, its way of life, its values, its language, and all the story it carries. Story, however, has its own way of surviving and resurfacing. Elders past and present carry their people's story and pass it on orally from generation to generation. So it is with some anticipation that I prepare to sit at Shane's feet and listen. Shane would have every right to carry some deep resentments and to feel ill at ease among the European latecomers to his country. As an economic migrant from Europe to his ancestral home, I might have felt a bit sheepish in the presence of one of our country's Aboriginal owners. Instead, Shane welcomes me warmly and we walk together along the grassy slopes of Nadaya. As I listen to Shane, I am learning stories that have been carried by the original Australians for some 60,000 years. Among these stories are mysterious Dreamtime narratives which speak of who we all are and where we all come from. Late in the 18th century, the early British colonizers of New South Wales noted their Aboriginal neighbors' strong attachment to the land. They knew their land, how to read it, how to preserve it, and how to farm it. It therefore came as some surprise that when asked, "Where do your people come from?" the Aboriginal elders pointed the newcomers not to Australia's red ochre soil, but to the stars, and not just any stars. Their ancestral source, according to this narrative, was a world orbiting a star somewhere in the constellation we call the Pleiades. This is not the first time I have heard of such a connection with the Pleiades. At a gathering of researchers in Sydney, Australia, I got deep into conversation with the pastoralist called Blair. Blair's family farm, or station as we call it in Australia, was home to hundreds of sheep and cattle. It was also a place that seemed to attract UFOs. Indeed, on that station, groups of craft were witnessed regularly, and by groups of people over a 20-year period. When he told me this, I had to ask, "Blair, do you think there was something about that place or about your family that made your visitors feel free to keep turning up?" I meant, wasn't your family afraid? "Oh, no," said Blair. "My family are Cherokee. My father taught me that some of those who come have been visiting us since the beginning of our people's history. They came to our ancestors and taught us how to live as people on this planet, taught us about foods and medicines, and told us where they were from, a planet orbiting a star in the Pleiades." The great leap forward that our ancestors made from living on the planet in animal subsistence to the civilized life of a crop farming, city-building civilization is an anomalous moment in human prehistory that has long fascinated paleobiologists and which begs for an explanation. The story of our being assisted in this great leap by prehistoric visitors from the Pleiades is an indigenous explanation, handed down through the ages from one generation to the next by Aboriginal Australians and by Cherokee people alike. Today, as we stand together at Nadaya, the slopes of Mount Ainslie, Shane shows me land that has been home to such stories for tens of thousands of years. We walk up to a place of corroboree. Its level floor is a shingle of tiny stones and even tinier fragments of animal bone. The floor is bounded by the natural amphitheater of a ridge of rock, behind which is a magnificent view of the valley, backgrounded by brown hills and the blue-green mountains of the far horizon. For millennia, Aboriginal men gathered here from tribal communities scattered along a rocky ridge in the continent, 1,000 miles long. The amphitheater of sitting rocks is part of that ridge. On these same rocks men have sat and conferred, renewing friendships and accords as they swap the sharp bone tips on their hunting spears. Where we are standing now is where the elders prepared the young men for initiation. See these stone markers? See how they have been carved to make a viewfinder? It points across the valley to the top of Tidbinbilla. That is where the initiation would happen. The elders would show the boys the plain below, what to look for, which fires meant invasion, which fires meant a request to come on to country. It is a beautiful, natural vantage point. From here, the elders could show the boys what was the men's work in protecting their tribe and their country, what their place was in the community. Behind us is the mountain for secret women's business. That's not something I can tell you about. This is an incredible place. The cultural significance of Nadaya would be difficult to exaggerate. I feel privileged to have my feet on this soil. At the heart of the site is the beautiful petroglyph of a kangaroo, carved with great beauty and elegance into the granite. It is a work of art that would have taken many years to create, an enormous effort simply to carry one aspect of this great canon of storytelling. I breathe in the magnificence of this sacred place. There's no doubt this should be a World Heritage Site. It should be, says Shane, but it's been sold to a developer for a complex of townhouses. Where you are standing is designated for a tennis court. This is only one of the latest assaults on the world's oldest continuous culture. Indeed, you can draw a straight line from that moment 15 minutes after Captain Cook's landing at Botany, when crew of HMS Endeavour began shooting the local Aboriginal people, to the events of 2020 with the blowing up of Aboriginal caves in the Juukan Gorge of Western Australia, and would-be destruction of this sacred site in Canberra. When the mining corporation Rio Tinto went into Juukan Gorge, they found a 4,000-year-old genetic link to present-day traditional owners, along with evidence of continual human occupation going back at least 46,000 years, making it the only inland site in Australia demonstrating continual occupation through the last ice age. The history carried by the place is incredible and unique, but this year Rio Tinto blew it up with not much more than an anemic apology for any offense caused. They call us the traditional owners, says Shane, and what that phrase does is convey the message that our people are the former owners. Now this land belongs to someone else. They call my people prehistoric, he says. It's a way of saying that anything Aboriginal Australians have to say about the past is outside of real history. Only white story is called history. What Aboriginal Australians say doesn't even count as history. This is the grim way conquests go. When new empires arrive in a country, or whenever new regimes establish themselves, they have to take charge of history. It is the colonizers who will shape the syllabus in education, and the history celebrated in statues and carvings. All other truths must be extinguished. That is why Aboriginal Australian narratives of humanity being seeded from the Pleiades is a story absent from our school curriculums. The colonizers didn't endorse it. It is why the Native American stories of star people arriving and nurturing our ancestors' ability in nutrition, medicine, and farming have also not made it into school textbooks and official histories. The Europeans didn't originate the story, therefore it is not history, it is mythology. and for mythology read fiction. This is the way we are taught to ignore the body of history curated by indigenous peoples. Because it will survive orally, and for that reason cannot be completely extinguished without extinguishing the culture itself, indigenous story must therefore be framed as folklore or fiction. That way it can never address questions that we consider historical or scientific. The folklore/fiction label teaches us to expect only cute stories or irrelevance from the world's ancestral narratives. The removal of ET narratives from our official canons of science and history is a pattern that recurs through the ages. I first saw this pattern as I sifted my way through the book of Genesis, tucked away in my shipping crate. Reading the ancient text, with Elohim as a plural, surfaced a whole new reality, a forgotten world in which many different kinds of entities cohabited and interacted with our prehistoric ancestors. A forgotten world in which a body of ET colonizers duke it out over the ins and outs of Project Earth. Today, there is a broad consensus among biblical scholars that this mishmash of Elohim stories received a drastic edit sometime in the 6th century BCE. By this time, Judaism had become firmly monotheistic. This meant that the memory of other gods, the echoes of the Sumerian stories of sky people, all had to be airbrushed out of the Hebrew canon. The problem of too many gods could be dealt with, so the editors must have thought, by translating the word Elohim as false god or demon. By translating the word Elohim as false god or demon in the text where the Elohim concerned were clearly on the wrong side, and then translating it as God where the Elohim concerned appeared to be in charge. Problem solved. Except that the previous shape of the stories remains. Clues surface whenever God does brutal and inhumane things, or when God opposes human progress or fails to anticipate events that even a child could see coming. Yet the translators clearly believed they were being faithful to the Hebrew tradition by cleaning up the text this way and layering new meanings and imperatives over the top of them. The editors may have reasoned that Moses himself had commanded that these other Elohim be forgotten. For instance, the Ten Commandments famously begins with the commands, "You shall have no other Elohim before me. You must not bow down to them or even depict them." Exodus 20, verses 3 through 5. It appears that a great forgetting is being commanded. Moses' successor Joshua effectively repeats the same command as he inherits the mantle of leadership. He says, "This is what Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, the powerful one of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and served other powerful ones. Now fear Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh and serve him with all faithfulness. Cut yourselves off from the powerful ones your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt and serve Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Will it be the powerful ones your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates River, or the powerful ones of the Amorites, in whose land you are living? As for me and my household, we will serve Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh." Joshua 24. It was only when I started reading the Elohim as plural entities, indeed as another name for the Sumerian sky people, that it became clear to me that a policy of censure and forgetting is actually embedded within the story of the Bible itself. And the final edit of the Bible does not mark the end of the forgetting. As I revisited the beginnings of Christian history, my studies led me to significant church fathers who leaned away from accepting the Hebrew canon at face value and leaned towards a quite different story of our emergence, one summarized in the words of the Greek philosopher Plato. These rather interesting church fathers included people like Clement of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, Origen, and Marcion. All were foundational leaders within the kaleidoscope of early Christianity. Each in their turn argued in effect for an Old Testament of Plato and a New Testament of Jesus Christ. They regarded the Elohim narratives of the Hebrew scriptures as being something other than stories about God, and interpreted them in a way that harmonized with Plato's explanation of beginnings, an explanation which sounds many of the same notes as the Aboriginal and Native American stories I mentioned before. However, this broader view was soon to be shut down by the institutional gatekeepers. In 144 CE, Marcion was excommunicated. The 6th century BCE edit of the Hebrew Scriptures was ruled in, and Marcion's Platonized interpretations were ruled out. In 543 CE, Origen was condemned as a heretic, having powerfully influenced Christian theology for 3.5 centuries. His was the most influential voice of those times, subtly directing God-seekers away from the edited Hebrew stories and towards the writings of Plato. By those actions, the gatekeepers of the church institution sent out an emphatic signal, namely that Platonic ideas, which included the stories of a big universe populated with an array of entities, some of whom had interacted with and adapted our ancestors, were to be understood as being totally out of bounds. Orthodoxy would have no room for them. The removal from Christianity of these broader views was really concretized by the 4th century CE Roman Emperor Theodosius. In 381 CE, to help all good citizens be good Christians, Emperor Theodosius decided it would be expedient for him to wade into a theological debate, then raging in the church, and settle it with a stroke of the imperial pen. Theodosius's legislative input had a number of probably intended consequences. Firstly, it cemented the ranks of hierarchy in the institutional church as a pyramid of powers with the people at the bottom, the bishops sandwiched in the middle, and the emperor emphatically at the top. Secondly, it settled decades of public conversations and conflicts in which violence and murder were often the tools of theological debate. Theodosius's legislation imposed an official peace within an institution that he considered ought to harmonize rather than polarize the good citizens of the empire. Thirdly, and most importantly of all, Theodosius's promulgation clarified that it was the emperor who was the ultimate arbiter of what was true and what was false. Any ruling power or conquering force has to take charge of the narrative of history. It was the job of the empire to provide the people with its Department of Information. This was not something that could be left to local chieftains, indigenous priesthoods, or ancestral traditions. The era of kaleidoscope Christianity was emphatically over. Orthodoxy had landed. On the face of it, Theodosius was guillotining a long-standing tussle over a fine point in Christian theology. But what he had really done by stepping in so decisively was to militarize the forces of orthodoxy and turn into rebels and subversives all the leaders of the now officially fringe spiritual and religious sects. Henceforward, every indigenous priesthood with a story of its own was to be considered suspect and might be better disbanded. Every written text proposing narratives of human origins and other worldly contexts at odds with orthodoxy's neat and tidy creation story would need to be removed from the shelves of acceptable literature. They were now texts to be archived or burned, not taught. Uniformity was the order of the day. The vast array of languages and alphabets scattered throughout Rome's international territories were pushed down to the grassroots. Business, law, science, education, and religion were all to be conducted in the imperial language of Latin. Suppressing local languages and ancient alphabets served many purposes, not least that it buried the histories and ideas expressed in the old languages and etched in foreign carvings and glyphs. It was not the last time an empire would attempt to silence ancestral story. In the 15th century, the Catholic imperial forces of Portugal and Spain began their invasions of Central and South America to claim their respective pieces of the New World. As they established their hegemony over the indigenous peoples of the land, they did the exact same thing Emperor Theodosius had done more than 1,000 years before. Every agency of control that had followed piecemeal in the wake of Theodosius's promulgation was now combined into a swift and decisive methodology, which the invading forces rolled out in rapid succession to quickly establish full-spectrum dominance over their new territories. All indigenous priesthoods were rounded up and summarily executed. Their books and scrolls were confiscated and burned, with perhaps the best specimens sent to Rome to join the vast library of texts curated by successive generations of emperors and popes. Among the suppressed South American texts were those of the Mayan tradition. Its accounts of human origins differ significantly from the version of events now being promulgated through the Catholic schools and churches which now peppered the landscapes of South America. It was the job of these institutions to explain definitively to every person resident in the newly Christian territories the official explanation of where we all came from. The Catholic authorities may have hoped that the country's indigenous history was well and truly dead and buried, being either under lock and key or in cinders. However, time would tell that Mayan memory was far from lost. In the next chapter, I will take you to the mountains of Guatemala, where we will discover that the Mayan tradition, like all ancestral memory, has a surprising longevity and a curious way of returning from the dead. That is the end of chapter 4. Peace and blessings to you all.